Welcome back to Bunny Trails, everyone. Cold Open, I'm Dan Pugh, and we're here with a retro episode. This week, we're looking into the archives going back to July of 2021, where we looked at the phrase, Bob's your uncle. This one was interesting because it's a good example of how our understanding of a phrase's origins can change as more evidence is found. In this case, the digitization of additional works provided an avenue for researchers from Kansas, that's us, to find works from history, in this case from the early 1890s. Before we jump into it, I want to give a quick shout out to our patrons. Without them, we would not be able to make this show. We have free tiers and paid tiers, so you can join the community at whatever level fits your budget. And a special thanks to Pat Rowe and Mary Halsig Lopez. With that, here is episode 118, originally airing on July 28th, 2021, Bob's Your Uncle.
Welcome to Bunny Trails, a whimsical adventure of idioms and other turns of phrase. I'm Shauna Harrison.
And I'm Dan Pugh. Each week, we take an idiom or other turn of phrase and try to tell the story from its entry into the English language to how it's used today. Back in May of 2020, that's about 14 months ago for those of you who are listening to this as part of a binge session, and good for you if you are. But back in May of 2020, our friends at the Lexitexture podcast did listener questions for episode 65. One of the questions was on the origins of the phrase, Bob's your uncle. Now, Lexitexture usually takes a word and explores it, while we take a phrase and explore that. Our two podcasts are not officially affiliated in any way, but we at Bunny Trails see them as fellow members of the Word Nerd family. So if you like what we do, you'll probably like what they do. But back to Bob's Your Uncle, Ryan, one of the hosts, gave a brief synopsis of the phrase and suggested that we might take a deeper look at it. So this phrase has several stories floating around about its origins, but there is a forerunner. But first, let's define the phrase. From the Oxford English Dictionary, Bob's your uncle. Quote, everything is all right, end quote. That's really unhelpful, Oxford English Dictionary. Because this is one where I feel like the Oxford English Dictionary has done a poor job, as the phrase all right can be idiomatic in its usage just by itself.
Yeah.
Like everything to the right of something, or like what? I don't understand. So anyway, let's look at another one then. From the Cambridge Dictionary, quote, used to mean that something will happen very quickly and simply, end quote. So with this example phrase, just tell him you're a friend of mine, and Bob's your uncle, you'll get the job.
Okay.
Which is an interesting segue to the most prominent origin story because it deals with someone getting a job because of who they know. In this case, nepotism, which, according to Merriam-Webster, means, quote, favoritism as an appointment to a job based on kinship, end quote. And on the same page for this entry for nepotism, Merriam-Webster's gives us a little bit more information. Quote, during his papacy from 1471 through 1484, Sixtus IV granted many special favors to members of his family, in particular his nephews. This practice of papal favoritism was carried on by his successors, and in 1667, it was the subject of Gregory Leedy's book, and I'm going to read the English translation here, The History of the Pope's Nephews. Shortly after the book's appearance, nepotism began to be used in English for the showing of special favor or unfair preference to any relative by someone in a position of power, be it ecclesiastical or not. The nep, N-E-P, spelling is from nepote, a 17th century variant of Italian nepote, meaning nephew, end quote.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, I thought it was a little fun side thing. Now, I will say we have on occasion seen where dictionaries have put put like their best point in time understanding up, and it's doesn't always hold the test of time because we learn more about stuff and more things get digitized. But so I didn't really follow up on the origin story of the word nepotism, as it wasn't the subject of today's phrase.
Right.
But I don't really have any reason to question what Merriam-Webster has on it, especially since the OED does show the word originating in, quote, 1667 or earlier with reference to popes, end quote.
Okay.
So at least two different sources then that are reputable, realistic sources have said that, there's some things there. But before we talk about the most likely origin story, which involves nepotism, I'll run through a couple of other ideas. So first, I want to read an excerpt from a post by Liz Potter of the Macmillan Dictionary blog. The publication date isn't given on the page. Rather, it just says 8 years ago. So I'm going to assume that it auto-updates, and which means this was most likely written in 2013. Quote, "The first citation of this phrase in OED refers to an entry in Partridge's Dictionary of Slang, 1937. But Partridge cannot shed much light beyond claiming that it has been used since circa 1890 and speculating that it may be an elaboration of the low slang phrase all is Bob, meaning all is safe." End quote.
What?
Have you ever heard this phrase, all is Bob?
Not one I've heard before.
Okay, well, I found reference to it in Francis Gross's Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, 1811, which I have a copy of because you got it for me for Christmas or my birthday or something. I don't remember, so thank you for that. But I found a reference to Bob on the entry, Bob. Quote, "A shoplifter's assistant, or one that receives and carries off stolen goods. All is Bob, all is safe." End quote. And this is they note that this is a cant language in here. Now, this type of usage is likely what Eric Partridge was referencing, but it's important to note that Partridge wasn't born until 1894 and didn't begin publishing books on slang until the 1930s. And that will be important to note as we talk about dates later.
Okay.
I've heard all is Bob on rare occasions, but it sounds like it was probably more of a cant, or it came from a cant, or at least it was referenced in a cant book.
Right.
So
It's like,
from 1811, so at least in 1811, according to Francis Gross, all is Bob was a cant slang.
Right.
Which means it probably wouldn't have popped up into a lot of other areas at that point. This is from Gary Martin from the website The Phrase Finder, and this is phrases.uk.org. And he notes that there is another potential source, the Music Hall. Quote, "The earliest known example of the phrase in print is in the bill for a performance of a musical revue in Dundee called Bob's Your Uncle, which appeared in a Scottish newspaper, the Angus Evening Telegraph, in June 1924. End quote. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find much about this performance, and neither has anyone, it appears, who has referenced this performance. So I can't really tell like much about it. I don't know, like was the whole thing. I mean, like, was there a song, "Bob's Your Uncle," that was being performed here in 1924? Was there, was this some sort of a play on something, or was this referencing a phrase that was used in the language at the time? Because Eric Partridge had said 1890 was when he thought that it had originated, but didn't provide a citation for the work. So it's unhelpful.
Yeah.
Thanks, Eric Partridge, 1937. But without being able to find much more about this, I can't delve in to know, what kinds of things were happening. So, although I do believe Amy from the Lexitexture podcast is from Dundee, so maybe she would have some references that we would not have access to that are
help us
local.
out, Amy.
Yeah, I don't know. So, but anyway, so that musical review 1924, I'd be curious to know why it might have been called Bob's Your Uncle and what all was there. But
yeah.
Anyway, so I'm going to pick back up with the next line from Gary Martin's piece. Quote, "The expression also formed part of the lyrics of a song written by John P. Long and published in 1931, Follow Your Uncle Bob. The lyrics include, Bob's your uncle, follow your Uncle Bob. He knows what to do, he'll look after you." The song was sung and recorded by Flory Ford, end quote.
Okay.
But that was 1931 when that was written, and I will note it because I also found it in the 1931 in the catalog of copyright entries, 4th series held by the Library of Congress. So we know that song was actually written by J.P. Long of Great Britain in 1931.
Okay.
which means the 1924 thing was not involving that particular song. So there may have been something else. But I do want a quick side note about this amazing woman, Florrie Ford. So according to Jeff Brownrigg in his book Biography, Florrie Ford's real name was Flora May Augusta Flanagan. And from 1897, she lived and worked in the United Kingdom. She was one of the most popular stars of the early 20th century music hall. The concept here would be that her popularity would definitely have brought the phrase into the minds of a new generation.
Mm-hmm.
So we saw that song in 1931 and that she was singing, right? And it was written by John P. Long. And while I wasn't able to find much about John P. Long, assuming he was an adult when he wrote the piece, it's within the scope of possibility that he would have been of a generation that would use the phrase based on Eric Partridge's 1890 timeline. So it's entirely possible that it was a phrase already and that this was the impetus for the song itself that then Florrie Ford made popular and would have potentially brought in the 1930s this phrase to a whole new generation of people.
Yeah, this is like kind of fascinating. So that even that one reference that you couldn't pin down from Dundee was it a review from a music hall. So it's like there's a lot going on here that hard to tell how it all interlinks there.
Well, and part of that is because the popularity of you could do in music halls and in song and dance numbers what you could not do in proper written works. So
absolutely, yeah.
It would have been far more likely that if someone was exposed to a slang language, that they were probably exposed to it from music rather than from a newspaper or a written word. Otherwise, it was just orally spoken, and that means we may see some of these slangs either in dictionaries like the Dictionary of Vulgar Tongue, which wasn't meant to be like dirty words, just things that a proper prim and proper person wouldn't have put in print, right?
Yeah.
So it's the places we might be able to see things in slang languages written down first would be in music.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense too for those, performances going back, centuries, like jesters and things, performances frequently involved this kind of commentary, social commentary or statements that were allowed in public and not in other places. So yeah, that's cool.
Absolutely. Another story that's often floated is the popularity of yet another song and dance routine, Bob's Your Uncle and Fanny's Your Aunt. I saw many references to this being a bit of a call and answer, as in someone would say, Bob's your uncle, and another person would respond with, and Fanny's your aunt, or aunt. I'm not sure how it would be pronounced in the Queen's English. I normally say aunt, but then, for some people, like my Aunt Mem, I refer to her as aunt. I don't know why. Right. I don't know if it just flows better with her name or... Anyway, I have no idea why that's the case. One of our listeners probably does know, and you can inform us on any of our social media sites, but probably Twitter is the one that we'll see the fastest. I haven't figured out how to work Facebook, so I whatever. And sometimes I don't even see things on Facebook. I'm like, what? That was posted 12 weeks ago. How's that? Why is it just not coming on? All right, so this seems to have been popularized. This Bob's Your Uncle and Fanny's Your Aunt. It seems to have been popularized by a 1950s song of the same name that was composed by Tommy Connor and Eddie Lisbona. You can even buy a copy of the sheet music from 1954 right now on Amazon UK. But since this one originated in the 1950s, and we know the phrase was in use much earlier, we can eliminate this as an origin story, though it may have helped bring the phrase to yet another new generation and keep its popularity intact. So regardless of where this has come from now, it is entirely possible that the 1930s, it got a boost from the music halls, and then in the 1950s, it got yet another boost, which is why sometimes people of a certain age think that the phrase is Bob's your uncle and Fanny's your aunt, as if the Fanny's your aunt has just been dropped off.
Oh,
and
gotcha. So it's
certainly
a rejoinder that always was a part of the phrase.
So it certainly hasn't always been that way with Fanny's your aunt, but it seems to have fallen back off again now. But there was definitely a time frame in the 1950s to 70s where that was a very common way of that happening.
Yeah.
Okay, so for the forerunner, I want to return to the story our friends at Lexitexture mentioned, which is the version from Gary Martin. And that's the one I will read. That's, again, back from the phrases.uk.org website, the phrase finder. Okay. Because Gary, I think, does a really good job of covering this. Quote, The first idea, and one that many believe, is that Bob and his nephew were the Marquess of Salisbury and Arthur Balfour. Like many Victorian aristocrats, Salisbury, the 20th British Prime Minister, didn't lack for names, and his was as full as his beard. Robert Arthur Talbot Gascoigne Cecil, 3rd Marquess of Salisbury. For our purposes, we can cut that down to just Bob.
This is the best thing ever.
Gary has a way with words that I really appreciate. I'm a fan of his blog. Salisbury is widely believed to be the Uncle Bob that the expression refers to. Bob's your uncle is said to derive from the supposed nepotism of Lord Salisbury in appointing a favorite nephew, Arthur Balfour, to several political posts in the 1880s. Balfour went on to become prime minister after his uncle. His early political appointments were considered inappropriate as he had shown no prior interest in public work. It is unlikely that Arthur Balfour would ever have become a celebrated politician without the patronage of his influential uncle. Piers Brendon, in Eminent Edwardians, 1979, writes, "In 1887, Balfour was unexpectedly promoted to the vital frontline post of Chief Secretary for Ireland by his uncle Robert, Lord Salisbury." End all the quotes there.
Okay. I've heard there's some kind of a kid. As a kid, I remember hearing some sort of a poem or something written about Lord Salisbury, and I don't remember it at all. I just remember that it was a thing, some sort of a jokey nursery rhyme type, rhymey thing. So
I did not run across that. Okay, so these comments are the types of things I've run into when researching this phrase. The biggest gap in the Arthur Balfour story is, if true, that this phrase would have been used beginning in 1887, but then the next time anyone could find it in print is 1924 with the Dundee Music Review. So why would a phrase that originated in 1887 not make it into print until long after both politicians had left office? So every time I'm introduced to an old slang book or a new website that categorizes printed materials or that researches those materials, I pick up this and a few other phrases to see if there's any information that I've missed that could add to the puzzle. And recently, I ran across the website wordorigins.org by Dave Wilton. According to his site, Dr. Wilton has a PhD in medieval English literature from the University of Toronto and is the author of the 2004 book Word Myths, Debunking Linguistic Urban Legends.
That sounds amazing.
It is. It's in my shopping cart actually right now. I just need to hit go, but I've got a couple of them in here. There's another book that I ran across that I'll mention later that I also am buying a copy of.
Awesome.
He notes that he came across another website, wordhistories.net, which reported a usage from 12 November 1891. Dr. Wilton was unable to verify the usage, but he noted he had no reason to disbelieve it. And this caused me such great joy. I had a date. And
Yay.
It's one thing to say, all right, Eric Partridge said this was in use since the 1890s, and I have no reason to know, is that the first time he heard it, or did he see it in a place where it was written down? I don't know what level of diligence he did on that, but once I found a date, November 12th, 1891, I was like, okay, I can do this. So I tracked down the citation. And thanks to the British Newspaper Archives, I found the newspaper in question on page 5 in the Cuts and Thrusts section, which seems to be a series of short updates.
Okay.
And the paragraph that wordhistories.net and wordorigins.org were both mentioning was listed on page 5. And the byline says, "By Excalibur." This is out of the East Aberdeenshire Observer, November 12th, 1891. My apologies to anyone who lives in or around Aberdeenshire because of the way I said it. Okay, here we go. Quote, "Will the general body of feuars be prepared to sacrifice not only the enhanced rent, but all the recent outlay and improvements? Will they be ready to throw away the appreciably large portion of their revenue in obedience to the behests of a few social cranks, who, as is their nature, would have small scruple in sacrificing any interest which might even be supposed to conflict with their narrow and prejudiced notions? Teetotalers, as a rule, are always to be viewed with a certain amount of suspicion. The very principle, if principle it can be called, which differentiates them from the great mass of ordinary humanity, proves that there is a specially weak point in their natures, that they are morally and mentally lopsided, and therefore worth the watching. It is a relief to know that the lopsided viewers will be well watched while Bailey Ross sits at the board, and to him I with confidence address the council. Go as you have begun. Bob's your uncle. End quote.
Wow.
Yeah. So first thing, and those that follow us on Twitter might have seen this exchange between Amy, who is in Scotland from the Lex Texture podcast, and myself, because I was trying to figure out what the heck a fewer is. So according to the Dictionary of the Scots language, fewer is one who holds land in few, or a court held to administer the fewing of land, which is only marginally helpful because I don't know what few is either. So let's go with this. Few is spelled F-E-U. Few. The tenure of land in perpetuity in return for a continuing annual payment of a fixed sum of money to the owner of the land, formerly also for payment in kind or rarely for some token of value, merely, in all cases, paid as a commutation of the military service due by the vassal to a superior under the feudal system. Right, so few, feudal,
Okay.
fewer. All right, now things are
right.
starting to make more sense. In some of the examples listed on the site, fewers is used synonymously with proprietor, which I believe is how we're probably using it here in that concept as proprietors and landowners.
That makes sense.
So as a side note, the British Newspaper Archive lists the name of the paper as the Buchan Observer and East Aberdeenshire Advertiser, which probably means that these two newspapers either merged or separated to get the name that is on the actually printed paper, East Aberdeenshire Observer, in 1891.
Okay.
Now, I still haven't found any other sources of the phrase that's used between this one in 1891 and then the musical review in 1924. But as we mentioned, you may recall Eric Partridge's 1937 work, A Dictionary of Slang and Unconventional English, notes that the phrase is from around 1890, though he doesn't offer a specific citation for that work. So it is possible that this 1891 newspaper usage is the source to which he was referring, or it could be something else that is also used that he saw. But now we at least have something to link us to that time frame, the 1891.
Yes.
So like many English idioms, we may never know the true origins. The timeline does fit for Arthur Balfour. He was appointed the Chief Secretary of Ireland in 1887 by his uncle, the Prime Minister, and we see the phrase in use in 1891 in a Scottish newspaper, which narrows the previously identified gap in the story and makes it a much more plausible than previous evidence would have suggested. So next up, we want to look at how this phrase is being used in today's English. But first, we need to thank a few people for allowing us to continue this research and bringing it to you every week.
This episode is sponsored by our amazing patrons. Bunny Trails is and will always be free, but we are only able to make this content because of the awesome support of our patrons like Pat Rowe and Mary Halsick Lopez. Because of Pat, Mary, and many others, you don't have to pay a dime to enjoy Bunny Trails week after week. But even though Dan and I volunteer our time, there are still real costs to making the show, including hosting fees, equipment maintenance, domain costs, and more. And we turn to you, our listening community, to help cover those costs. To do that, we use Patreon, a service that allows you to support the creators and artists you love. Our patrons get exclusive behind-the-scenes content, early access to episodes, and access to our videos so you can actually watch along as Dan and I make the show. If you are in a financially stable place and would like to support this educational art form, we encourage you to check out the options. We are Bunny Trails Pod on Patreon, or find links to everything we do at bunnytrailspod.com.
All right, so let's look at a little bit more modern usage. I'm going to start with 1941. This is a statement from a German refugee to Britain commenting on the best way to learn English. This is November 27th, 1941, out of the Potter's Herald, which is East Liverpool, Ohio. Quote, testimony upon that point is offered by a German refugee, a woman who entered a government training center. This is what she says. I have been treated like anybody else by the managers and instructors alike. The people I have worked with have proved real comrades, as helpful to me as I always try to be to them. It is a matter of special enjoyment to me that they taught me, without their knowing, the English of the people, which I would never be able to find in any dictionary or textbook. Now I know the meaning of Bob's your uncle, that machine is a mangle, and so on. Joking apart, to my mind, it is best way for the refugees in England not to be trained separately, but to mix with English workmen. End quote.
That's really cool.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting take on it, and it's kind of what we were talking about earlier about how you'd never find something like that in a proper dictionary or something, not back in that day, because it was just not appropriate way to talk. But the colloquial language is the language that is mostly spoken. All right, so here's a song from 1991. It's called "Bob's Your Uncle" by Happy Mondays. And Happy Mondays are an English alternative rock band from Salford, Greater Manchester, formed in 1980. The track Bob's Your Uncle was released in 1991 in their album Pills and Thrills and Bellyaches. The phrase Bob's Your Uncle doesn't actually appear in the song lyrics at all, and I won't read the lyrics on the podcast as they describe a lively night in bed between four amorous souls. And we like that our podcast is sometimes used by teachers as optional assignments for their high school students, so we're just not going to read those right here.
Just leave that out.
Yeah, but patrons can stick around after the show to hear the lyrics on the behind-the-scenes video, which is available to patrons at any level. You can find out more at patreon.com/BunnyTrailsPod. There was also a TV game show that ran in late 1991 and into 1992. That was in the UK, and it's called Bob's Your Uncle, which was a short-lived wedding-based game show in which three newlywed couples would compete for £3,000 and a new car. It was hosted by comedian Bob Monkhouse. I also found a Chicago-based rock band that was called Bob's Your Uncle. In this case, your is spelled Y-E-R, Bob's Your Uncle. And this band was formed in 1995.
Okay.
And in a Daily Vault review of their 1999 album Innocence and Experience, Christopher Thelen said, quote, "The group reminds me of a poppier Smashing Pumpkins. The rhythms are complex, but do have a toe-tapping groove to them, and the vocals hide the darker tones of the lyrics in their simple beauty. The overall sound of Innocence and Experience is surprisingly excellent. This is something I've grown to not expect from an independent release. But beyond the poppy sound are some gray clouds, something that will come through on repeated listenings. From coming to terms with oneself to the melancholic existence of the populace, Bob's Your Uncle dares to try and be a thinking person's band. Such images might frighten some listeners away, but I think it actually adds to the musical texture that the band strives to create." End quote.
Well, that sounds really interesting, actually.
Yeah, I don't know. It seemed like they might still be together. They released an album in 2012 as well.
Okay.
So, well, I don't know. None of them, I mean, outside of their name being Bob's Your Uncle, none of the songs were that. So.
Right.
In 2015, Bob's Your Uncle, A Dictionary of Slang for British Mystery Fans by Jan Turner Lord. This is one that is in my thing as well. I'm going to hit purchase after we're done with the episode here.
Okay.
As I said, it came out in 2015. Here's the synopsis from Goodreads. Quote, "If it's a mystery to you what they're talking about in the hard-boiled slang of British mysteries, or if you're just a fan who delights in the colorful lingo of the limey lawman, Bob's Your Uncle, A Dictionary of Slang for British Mystery Fans by Jan Turner Lord will put you over the moon. There are hundreds of thousands of lovers of cozy British mysteries in the United States alone, readers of everything from Sherlock Holmes to viewers of BBC's EastEnders, and most will tell you that their infatuation has quickly turned into an addiction. But how many of us Yanks are fluent in the intricacies of limey lingo? Most know bobbies are policemen and pubs are bars. But what's a flash Harry? What's a donkey jacket? What's the difference between a knicker and a pair of knickers? With over 500 terms from aggro to Z, plus a special section on Cockney rhyming slang, Bob's Your Uncle is a right jumble sale of lexicography. It's not only a novel reference work, it's a whacking good read as well." End quote.
Yep, that sounds amazing. Yeah, I'm glad you're like yes, order that.
Yes, I'm going to buy that because a lot of that sounds really cool, and I just have a fascination with rhyming slang, so that's a lot of fun. Here's a roundup of a few uses from Twitter over the past week or so. On July 19th, the Turbinator said, "Got a great idea. Why don't we all use ice bags as mattresses or sleeping bags so we all just lay on ice packs or bags and Bob's Your Uncle?" This is clearly in reference to the record heat waves that have been happening over the last week in many places.
Yeah, that's...
Here's one from July 22nd along those same lines from Mr. G, and he's responding to how it's too hot to make a fire pit. "I used to dig a hole, gather some rocks and sticks, and Bob's Your Uncle. I now use a gas grill for this. For me, tastes better. That's a relatively inexpensive 40 quid charcoal grill you can get in Lowe's or Home Depot in the States. So it's not tall. It'll kill your back. And then they, of course, include an image of that grill.
Right. But I could see that over building the fire pit. That's it. Yeah.
Right. And on July 25th, in a conversation about gardens, yes, good idea. We grow potatoes in big pots. Really easy. Just put some away in a dark cupboard, wait till they sprout, plant them deep, and Bob's your uncle. And that was from Abigail.
Okay.
So we can see in all of these that there's this phrase is continuing to be used, and it is continuing to be used in a specific way.
Yeah, I like that, at the beginning, the definitions, are kind of, but I say like everything will be all right, or it'll just kind of happen. I like that quick solution. That's how I've always heard it used or used it. Is like, once you get to that point, everything else will just happen on its own and it'll be fine. It's all good.
Yeah, exactly. Well, special thanks again to our friends at the Lexitecture Podcast for suggesting we take a deeper dive on this one, even though it took me over a year to make it happen. I must say, I am so happy to be finally making this episode. In February of 2018, Shauna and I went to a restaurant, ordered some margaritas, and wrote down as many idioms as we could think of. We'd been talking about starting this podcast, but wanted to make sure there would be enough source material to even make a weekly show work. We decided we wanted to get to 100 to make us feel like it was viable, and Bob's Your Uncle was one of the first ones we thought of, mostly because it's been a running joke between Shauna and I for 20 years, because Bob really is Shauna's uncle. And there's no way I could have felt comfortable doing this episode without something new to add to the conversation. And finding Dave Wilton's commentary on the subject on his website, wordorigins.org, was the catalyst for getting me to the 1891 quote, which led credence to Arthur Balfour's story. Now, it's not that we can definitively say this is the origin, but it certainly removes some of the barriers we originally thought existed. And since Bob's Your Uncle seems to continue to be a popular way of saying, and there you have it, even today, it's good to give us a little more context in the history of its origins. That's about all the time we have for today. If you have a pop culture reference we should have mentioned, we'd love to hear about it. Reach out to us on social media, where we are at Bunny Trails Pod, or comment on our website, bunnytrailspod.com. Of course, the best way to make sure we see your comment is to post it on our Patreon page.
If you have a chance, leave us a review on your listening app of choice, or head over to podchaser.com, where you can leave a review for the show as a whole or individual episodes of the show. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week. And until then, remember,
Words belong to their users.